I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly global podcast where we do deep dive interviews each week with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, scientists, artists, entertainers, and opinion shapers, and we include your questions and comments. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely topics and issues, distinguished, we like to feel, by high-level content and technical excellence. And we invite you to become members of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. In this episode, we talk to researcher Ellen Galinsky, co-founder, president, and director of the nonprofit Families and Work Institute, and chief science officer and executive director of the Bezos Family Foundation. A graduate of Vassar, she also has a master's degree from the Bank Street College of Education, and she is the author of over 100 books and reports and over 300 articles, best known for The Mind in the Making and the 6 Stages of Parenthood. Her most recent book is The Breakthrough Years. And I want to remind you that we welcome your questions and comments, and I welcome Ellen Galinsky. Delight to have you here. Welcome.
Such an honor to be with you.
Well, same here. I mean, you have made a major contribution, and kudos to you for that, to how we understand stages of life and parenthood and family, and we'll try to get into all of those things and probe them with you. I also want to say that before we went on here, we were talking about mutual hero, Erik Erikson, who sort of paved the way for understanding identity and was a big influence on Ellen and her work. But lately, I know you've been thinking about the teenage brain, and I know there's all these cliches about the teenage brain being rebellious, and I think you call it a hormone minefield. That's all accurate, and those are maybe a little bit too stock, but nevertheless, it doesn't get mature until the 20s, and I really want to begin by asking you what neuroscience has taught us, or what we've learned now from neuroscience about understanding this whole phenomenon of what we call the teenage brain.
Neuroscience tended in the beginning to have a more simplistic view of the teenage brain. That is, that the reward system was developing dramatically and that the cognitive control system was much slower to develop. And that is, as with all kind of if you want to call them stereotypes or views, that is true in part. If you just took a cross-section of fMRIs of adolescents' brains, you would see that. But if you actually follow young people longitudinally and you look at different parts of each of these systems, it doesn't turn out to be true. The cognitive control system is as developed in some ways as the adult, but it gets overloaded by emotion. So I think it's the emotion that if it's a very intense situation that kids care a lot about, then they don't necessarily use the cognitive control aspect of their brain, but otherwise they do. So the analogy was like a car with your pedal on the metal and the brakes don't work. The brakes work perfectly fine depending on the situation. So I think that we've refined that view, and that view was actually hurting kids because they were seen as making dumb decisions. Almost all of the research from the very beginning of the field in 1904, when G. Stanley Hall wrote the first 2 volumes on adolescent development and created the field of adolescent development research, the focus was on storm and stress, on the hormonal minefield, on the making stupid decisions, the kinds of things you were talking about. But researchers now, by and large, see it very differently.
Well, what do they tell us about risky behavior and self-control? I mean, that we need to know and that we can actually put into practice.
Evelina Kroon from the Netherlands says it really wonderfully. She did a longitudinal study of 299 young people. She followed them for many years, and she said she started to wonder. She'd studied negative risky behavior like almost all researchers did, but she began to wonder why almost all kids are what's called sensation seekers. That is, they have very strong emotional responses, and yet very few in her sample and in many other samples make really dumb, risky decisions. So she was wondering what was going on, and what she ended up feeling is that adolescence, the brain is exploratory. It's that bird moving out of the nest. and that the emotions, this is now Adriana Galvin's research, the emotions are there for a reason. They help you figure out, they help young people figure out what's safe, what's not safe. Who should I be friends with? Who shouldn't I be friends with? Where do I belong? Where don't I belong? So that they need to be, I call it emotional detectors, to figure these things out. So rather than see it as a negative, researchers, this is the Center for Adolescent Development, they're seeing it as a positive, exploratory, adventuresome. There's really interesting research, I think, by Ron Dahl at Berkeley, where he looked at whether adolescents, in a sense, were making stupid decisions. And some people thought that was because they weren't fearful. They just didn't understand the consequences of their behavior. And what he found is, in fact, they're more fearful. But what they're doing in this stage across different cultures is learning to be brave. So as they move out into the world, they need to have a strong emotional reaction. They need to be exploratory, and they need to, Ron Dahl calls it learning to be brave. They need to learn how to manage, how to be brave, how to overcome the circumstances of their own lives.
Well, the burden on parents is they're supposed to trust your kids, let them take chances, trial and error and all of that. But they're not often making the kind of decisions that obviously parents want them to make, or for that matter, society wants them to make. They're just doing things with impulse or without mediating between what they think and then bringing it into action or fruition.
Well, one study, this was in the Netherlands too, found that 7 out of 10 kids weren't that way. So they can make good decisions. Here's the thing that I feel really strongly. We aren't teaching them to be good decision makers. We aren't promoting their development in what I would call autonomy supportive ways. They need to have some autonomy. I think of that as a basic psychological need, just like self-determination theory, as you know, believes. But if we don't help them learn the skills of good decision making, then maybe they won't learn decision making. And I did 2 nationally representative surveys of parents, and I could look at how many parents were autonomy supportive or not, and found that 23% were highly autonomy supportive. But that leaves 75% of us who could learn that instead of just this kind of, oh, that was so stupid, or just say no, or any of the other, or why did you do it this way, or when I was your age, or, all of those sorts of things. If we just help them learn the skills for taking on challenges, we would be in a much different situation.
Do we have peer influences, though, sort of going against some of those skills that we're trying to, about autonomy and the rest of it that you're talking about?
I think that there are things in us that go against them. One is, I would, it's called the cognitive bias of the curse of knowledge, which is that because we know something, we know that might not be the best decision. We act as if they're not smart rather than helping them learn the skills. We say, no, just don't do that, or that's stupid, or why are you doing that? In fact, so many, when I ask young people in the surveys that I did to write in about what adults should know about people their age, they said, we're smarter than you think. So I think we need to appreciate that they're doing developmentally exactly what they need to do. I have written and photographed 2 bird books where I watched baby birds leave the nest just by chance. One I did when I was pregnant with my first child and was housebound, and there was a nest right outside of my window, and I got fascinated with the baby birds were being expected, and I was expecting, and so I photographed them, and then I got interested in birds and did another bird book about a baby cardinal. And you see when they go out of that nest, they need to explore, they need to be pushed a little and they need to explore. But the baby bird's mother is there, or father is there helping them learn, how to avoid the skunk or the cat in both of my books that were dangers.
Well, you gave me an opportunity to do a little promotion of the fact that I think we're going to do a podcast soon with Amy Tan. For those who are, like you, interested in birds, should be really worth hearing, even for those who perhaps just want to learn more about birds that they don't know. Let me shift gears here for a moment and think, since you're talking about the right ways to bring up children, there was a kind of craze for a while. I'm thinking about childhood now, and you've written a book about the 7 life skills that every child needs. Mm-hmm. And certainly they need, perhaps above all, I would think, love and support, and a value system. But I was thinking about all of this kind of exposure that used to be discussed about let kids listen to Beethoven and Mozart when they're, in the cradle or whatever, expose them to Picasso, this kind of, what does research tell us about that? How much really is it going to help them in brain development, for example?
Well, you're so right that, it was a craze. I remember the craze when governors were saying, Mozart in the delivery room, so forth, and every family will get CDs. I think that, and you're so right also about the importance of relationships. Children learn through their relationships with the important people in their lives, through us as parents, through us as teachers, through us as grandparents, through us as aunts and uncles, whoever the important relationships are. That's really how they learn. And they learn by watching us and not just listening to us. They're, I see you was one of the things that they wrote into the survey. I see, with a C and then a U letter. They are watching and learning from us and from our example. And that's what's most important, what researchers would call sensitive and responsive care, where we're responding to them, we're building on what they do and know. So if you're singing a family song that you love, you don't have to play Mozart. If you're doing things that you care about and you're introducing your children to the world that they love, that's what's most important.
A question from Reed in Santa Rosa, one of our regular followers, and he wants to know, with your research, how you see recent events on college campuses in light of, your research or the research that's out there.
I think that there's a need to contribute, a need to try to make the world a better place. And thank goodness we have that need. Civilization needs us to have that need to progress. We want to have a sense of purpose. We want to have our lives meaningful. We have a need to contribute. I think that the protests that we're seeing represent young people not wanting the world to be the way it is, but wanting it to be better, whether they're as well informed as they should be about the nuances of the complexities of this war between Israel and Gaza. People could argue about that. But I think that the need to do something about the things you don't like is really very powerful and very wonderful. Instead of studying negative risks, researchers have suddenly started to look at positive risks. Larry Steinberg, who's done a lot of the research on negative risks, did a search in 2019 and found that there were only 3 papers on positive risks, and all kids could use positive risks. So how I feel about the protests is that it's a good thing in general that kids care. And I think that if you look at how different college campuses have handled them, you can see that this is for better or for worse. The campuses that have just said, you're so stupid, or stop it, have had a lot more problems than the colleges, and you could see them in the news every day. I listen to them, where they've engaged in a discussion. They use it as a teaching opportunity. How can you contribute? And I think we should be giving young people lots of opportunities to contribute to the world. You see it in the passion that they have for this.
Yeah, the passion and the idealism is certainly the positive side, but it's been kind of appalling how when you talk to these kids about what's going on in the Middle East, they're just pretty abysmally ignorant. They don't know what's going on. They want to belong. There's that importance that you shape for readers of your work about the importance of belonging. And that really seems a central role here, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And one of a colleague of mine who read the book said that schools should know what gangs know. This need to belong is so powerful that in good circumstances we should be using it. Yes, they do want to belong. But again, I think having seminars, having discussions, hearing alternate views, would help people understand, and they're going to form their own views. I listened to a podcast on the Daily the other day where a young woman who was part Jewish ended up with a very different view from her grandfather, but they ended up respecting each other's view. So I think but she worked very hard at being informed, and he worked very hard at informing her. And so I think that this is a teaching opportunity, and isn't the university a chance for us to learn?
Let me thank Reed for his question, and I'll thank Barry from Washington, Pennsylvania for this question. He wants to know, do smaller families contribute to helicopter parents? I grew up in a large family, 6 kids, and my parents just didn't have time to hover, but we still have brothers and sisters to help when we needed it.
Well, the real difference in helicopter or snowplow or whatever we want to call parents is whether they fix things for kids or whether they don't. And you can, yes, it's harder to do that if you've got 6 kids than one child or 2 children. Absolutely. You have more at stake, you feel like, there are more, if you just have one child, it's, oh my gosh, but I love what Wendy Rolnick at Clark University says. She studies autonomy, supportive caregiving, teaching, and parenting. And she looks at that with as a part of structure. Kids need structure. It's not just let kids go out and be autonomous and do anything. But she says there can never be too involved of a parent if that parent is autonomy supportive. So your caller had brothers and sisters to help. We have the need for help and guidance and that sort of thing. I think that we're sort of having the wrong discussion about helicopter parents. What we should know is we need to be autonomy supportive when we help our kids.
What about the idea that you should be a friend to your kid or a pal? I never much bought into that. It seemed to me overdone, in fact. Again, maybe part of a craze at one time, but there are those who give it a good deal of credence. What do you say?
I think that a number of people in my generation who may have had more standoffish parents want to be more emotionally connected to their kids. And they might define that as being a friend. No, they need a parent. They don't need a friend. I would agree with you.
They need structure, as you said, yes?
Yeah, they need structure and they need to learn the skills. They need autonomy support. They need to learn the skills that they're going to need to have in the world. But I've now my kids are grown up, and I don't know if I'd call them friends because I'm still their parent, and they're still my children, even though they're adults and have their own children. And in fact, my oldest grandchild just got married, so pretty soon I could be a great grandmother. Who knows? But we're very close, and I think that. So I did one talk where my kids came. I knew that I would be asked the question, "How did you screw up with your own kids? What did you do wrong?" So I asked my children, what did I do that was wrong? And they said I did tons of stuff that was wrong as a parent. But the difference was that I was always open to having a discussion about what wasn't working for them or not. I still was the adult, but I listened to them. And I got that from my mother, who always listened to me. So I think my mother gave me a little, forever my child, but now also my friend, a little pillbox or something that she got from the Met, when she was in her 90s then.
I commend you for your humility, and because I remember all too vividly when Bruno Bettelheim was giving a speech and somebody said, "Well, where did you do things wrong as a parent?" And he attacked the person who asked the question.
Ooh.
But that was kind of his modus operandi generally. There's Jerry from Aurora, Colorado. Thanks for the question, Jerry. He says, "Are you really saying kids rioting on college campuses and chasing Jewish students want to see a better world? Does that mean a world without Israel and Hamas in control from the river to the sea?"
Well, I said it before. I'm saying that the urge, the desire to make the world a better place is something that's very important to our civilization. It is a need, the need to contribute. Then I think we need to have education. And I think the college camp, I'm not saying that any of those things where anyone feels unsafe, where anyone feels stereotyped, where anyone feels scared for their own beliefs and identity, all of that is really wrong. But this is a chance for colleges and for high schools, and I think we should be doing it with younger kids. I asked my grandson, who's 11, whether they're having discussions about this at his school. I would hope they would be.
Well, let's talk about siblings now, since you mentioned that. And I wonder how much faith, credence, or stock you put into the ideas that we have come to think of from people like Alfred Adler or Frank Sulloway, that somehow birth order or being the only child, those kinds of things are keys to developments and to behavior and to a child's fate. You're shaking your head no. Okay.
No, not key. They can matter, but when you do meta-analyses of things like birth order or only children or so forth, a lot of the assumptions we have about them fade away. There is a goodness of fit. Here I will go to the research on attachment between parents and children. And you have a child who, if any of us have had more than one child, and I have, you know that every child comes to you with a slightly different temperament, and that works for you or doesn't work for you. And so it's in that interaction of us and the child, whether they're the first child or the second child or, the only child, that seems to make a big difference in development. And then kids, we are very important in children's lives, but we aren't the only thing shaping our children's lives. They come to us, with a temperament, with a certain style of being in the world. I love Jerry Kagan saying, though, that if you're born really shy, he could take a lot of those children, and then depending on the way that they were raised, some of them would exhibit it or not. So the way we raise our children at home, at school, and their community all make a difference, but they make a difference too, who they are.
I want to explore some of those things with you, but when you mention parental styles, and there's a lot to be said just about different parental styles, ought they to be somehow applicable to the child's temperament? Because, as you say, the temperaments are always different.
Yes, yes, they are. With a child who's, rushing out into the world, jumping off everything, uh, very intense and emotional, you would react one way, and you would react a different way to a child who's very shy and he's coaxing out to try something new. I still believe, though, from the decades that I've both done and looked at other people's research, that being autonomy supportive, which means giving kids skills to help them navigate the world, is important. And so Stephanie Carlson, she's at the University of Minnesota, talks about that she gave, this is little children, she gave 3-year-olds a puzzle that was probably for 4-year-olds, a little too hard for the kids to do. And what she found was that she and her colleagues observed how the parents reacted when they were told to just, help their child in any way that they might like to. She observed that some parents were over controlling, that is, they stepped in and did the puzzle for the child. Some parents were under controlling, they sat back and did nothing. And some parents were autonomy supportive, that is, they gave their kids, they didn't fix it for their kids, they gave their kids hints. Like, do you think, what shape do you think that the missing piece in the puzzle is? Can we see a shape that looks like that shape? Or that's blue. Can you see another piece that's blue, rather than, oh, here's the blue piece, I'll put it right in here.
Just what you said, I think, leads us to another apropos question from Sam in San Diego, who says, based on your decades of research, what is the single most important piece of advice you would give to parents today?
Promote their skills. There are executive function skills, and that can be misunderstood. It's, some people think it's soft skills. Some people never heard of it. People think it's just what has to do with ADHD. But I think that I started out with the same question as Jerry. I got concerned because I was doing a study of kids and looking at learning with older children. This is now 25 years ago. And I was interviewing children around the country and found that too many kids were not engaged in learning. Now we have nationally representative data, and I was right. There were, in our own study, we found that before the pandemic, 57% of kids were very engaged in learning in school. This is 9 through 19-year-olds. And during the pandemic, it was 33%. But that started me on an adventure story of looking at research to see what could help kids both learn and thrive. And across disciplines, I found that where executive function skills were being promoted, that kids were doing better. So you probably want me to define what that means, right?
Well, of course, for listeners who aren't familiar with it, I know you live by executive function skills. I mean, it's really part of the warp and woof of everything you stand for.
Yeah, it is. Because I found it to be so powerful in kids' development, a bigger predictor of school readiness than entry-level reading or math, a bigger predictor of school achievement, health, wealth, later in life. These are skills that have 4 parts to them, 4 sub-skills. They're sort of an umbrella concept. The umbrella you can look at as focus, that is, their attention regulation skills. And then under that is working memory, that is, using what you know. It doesn't mean just memorizing. It means the ability to use what you know. My grandson,
not just rote memory, which
no. That's the difference. Can you apply what you've learned to a new situation? The second part of executive function skills are cognitive flexibility. That is, you can't just do one thing over and over and over again. You need to adapt to the changing world. So understanding how other people think and feel, understanding what the situation calls for. The third part, and this would be largely more in the default network, but I think is very much a part of this set of skills, is reflection, being able to pause, to monitor, to think before you act, those sorts of things. And then self-control. If you're not achieving what you want to achieve, not going on automatic, but doing what you need to do to achieve a goal. And those are the 4 sub-skills, and they underlie setting goals, they underlie perspective taking, they underlie communicating and collaborating, they underlie they're the building blocks for so many skills of the things we think are important, like problem solving or that sort of thing.
Talking to Ellen Galinsky, her most recent book is The Breakthrough Years. And Olivia from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho wants to know, regarding a need to belong, what advantages or disadvantages does social media contribute to that need? And thank you for the question, Olivia. You don't see social media as the kind of villain that so many people see it as. And I think you've said the research isn't really there
True.
At this point, right?
I think there are a lot of problems with social media. I don't want to say, oh, it's wonderful, but I think that we always look for a bad guy, and we're seeing a lot of kids struggling with mental health problems now, according to the latest CDC figures. And so the obvious bad guy that most of us look to is social media. I've been advising to the federal government, the Undersecretary of Youth Mental Health, and we've been looking at kids' online health and safety. And we've been deep into the research beyond my book. And what's clear is that there are benefits and there's some real downsides, real harms to social media, and they're more harmful for some kids than other kids. How I feel about social media is that that the just say no approach won't work. That if we just say get rid of it all, it's just not. It's just so much a part of kids' lives that my grandson does his homework online. His assignments all come online. They can't just throw away all these devices. It's just part of their lives, and we need to manage it. And we aren't the only ones who need to manage it. I think tech companies, with the endless scrolls, with the algorithms, with the, content that is not appropriate for kids, there's a huge amount that needs to happen beyond what families can do. For families, I believe that it's a chance to help kids learn how to deal with, let's call it addiction. It's, sometimes it isn't an addiction, but if they're on it too much, help them learn how to manage it. That if they can learn how to manage social media when they're 11 or 12 or 13 or that sort of thing, in a way that they feel good about, look what they're going to do with some of the other challenges in life as they get older. It's just an opportunity to teach them a skill. But we shouldn't be in this alone. The government, the tech companies all have responsibilities to create social media in ways that aren't so harmful for kids.
Well, the harm is what continues to really press on many people's minds and hearts. I'm thinking particularly of body images and bullying that goes on and those kinds of things. But also, one can make the case that this is also too permissive parenting. I'm thinking about what went on in Michigan with a young kid going into school and shooting with a gun that was essentially given to him as a birthday gift. But social media feeds into all of those kinds of things. I think school shootings, I want to put all the blame on social media, but it's there as a culpable force in their lives.
Right. I mean, if you are angry and full of rage and hate, you can find other people who will not do you any good. If you are suicidal or depressed or angry, if you worry about being too fat or not being popular, all of those things are, particularly in the teenage years where you always have had imaginary audiences. I mean, when I was a kid, there were slam books where people, which now you have online.
But there's 42%, I saw that figure recently, of kids are suffering from some depression or anxiety. I mean, that's a startling and egregious number. Horrible.
It is. And we have to do a lot to deal with it. And one is social media, but there are other things that we need to do. Having kids, I found that when kids had their basic psychological needs to belong, to feel supported, to be treated with respect, to have some autonomy, to be able to figure out who they are, to be challenged and yet feel competent, to contribute, when they had those needs met, prior to the pandemic, by the relationships in their lives, they did pretty well during the pandemic. So I think that's one solution, which is help kids be in environments where they feel that they can thrive. Another thing is help them find ways, good ways, not just in the negative ways that we've been talking about with the protests, but ways to be helpers. I interviewed a number of kids who had experienced very severe suicidal ideation, even trying suicide, real mental health challenges, been institutionalized, been hospitalized, and so forth. And what helped them ultimately, obviously, therapy and if you can find it, real good help and support. But what also helped them was becoming helpers. That is, helping other kids who are going through these sorts of things. So I think that there's a lot we could do to call on other young people to be a positive force in each other's lives and help each other. Not the only solution, but I think it's part of the solution.
Part of it, indeed. And here's Bill from Chicago who wants to know what you think about how AI will affect teenagers of today.
Well, it's like it's like technology. I've been working with AASA, the School Superintendent Organization, and at their conferences, there are many speakers who say kids need to learn this. This is the currency of the future. They need to learn having these skills as a part of AI are going to be as important as, we thought different skills were when we were younger. Like, when you put on your resume, the kinds of skills. If you're competent in technology, it's going to be a real boon. So we need to learn to manage the world of AI, not let it manage us. And I was in Pittsburgh about 2 weeks ago with the Grable Foundation and went to visit a school that a man named Bill Strickland had founded and created, which was an after-school program for kids of all ages. But they were learning how to work with AI. They were learning how to make, if they love games, they were learning how to make games. They were being creators, not just consumers. And I think that's important.
Now, since you've had so much involvement with schools and working with superintendents, any advice for parents who find that their kids are just recalcitrant or adverse when it comes to school? I mean, a lot of kids are just, I don't get anything out of school. It bores me. I hate it.
Well, I wish that they weren't right. They are often right. I think what I find in the school organizations that I'm working with, like AASA, is that they know that that's true, and they think that schools have to change.
Change in what ways, though? Where would that change?
Well, I
think they begin?
We've been through the No Child Left Behind. We've been through the period where everything was tests and scores and and pressure, and that feels to me, it feels very intense to kids. I just was in California speaking to a group of young people, and they were talking about just the huge pressure that they felt always to get the right score, to be in the right after school group, to be, to the right activities so that they could apply for college, so they could be ready for whatever the future was, and that they weren't really being allowed to live right now. So I think that I would like to see school engagement as a metric. If we measured how engaged kids were in school as just one metric, not just their scores, but as one metric, I bet that we would unleash teachers' ability who, so many teachers feel like they're just teaching to the test. And we would help unleash the reason that they got into education in the first place, which is really to teach, to contribute, to engage kids. And so, that's one possible solution. I don't know where we're going to end up in the work we're doing because we're just beginning it, but kids need to learn in the way that they learn best, which is trial and error, experiential, often hands-on in the beginning. It needs to feel meaningful, and that doesn't necessarily mean fun. It can be challenging. And it needs to be engaging. And there are a number of studies that have been looking at the ideal moment of learning. This is Barbara Schneider's work and these people are all in the book, but Barbara Schneider has an experiment at Michigan State where she looked at what are the moments of engagement. And there were moments where kids were really engaged. They felt that they were stretched. That is, they had the skills to do it, but they were just on the edge of, of learning to do it better. And there was a little bit of anxiety. It wasn't all happy ever after, but there was also the sense of I don't know, corporations measure engagement. And I think it's important for us in education to begin to look at making learning more engaging.
How do you measure engagement, though?
There are measures. I use it in my nationally representative studies. There's a group of researchers at Utrecht, a university in the Netherlands, who have a paper and pencil measure of engagement. You rate how, does time fly, those sorts of things. And then they've been adapted for schools, and that's the measure that Barbara Fisher used too.
12 to 14, the toughest period to get kids really engaged and keep them engaged?
Well, that's a period of very rapid brain development, and that the transition into adolescence is any transition. It's kids are moving from middle school, then to high school, or junior high school, however the school system does it. And it's any period of transition is just a hard period in our lives when we're going from something we know to something new. And it's a period when kids are changing. And, as one mother said to me, she looked at her son. He was, suddenly growing like wild, didn't have pimples, didn't recognize himself, felt like, who is this person? Not the person that he knew. So changed. And then it was getting different teachers had different assignments on different days. They might give your assignment on Monday. It was due in 2 weeks. They didn't remind you. There's so much new to get used to. And the mother said, it's really a lot.
There's a question from Terry in Sarasota who asks, and thank you, Terry, what effective communication strategies have you found can help parents navigate conflict and maintain positive relationships with their teenage kids?
That was something that teenagers had a lot to say. I asked the question in the nationally representative study I did, what should the adults of America know about people your age? And they wrote about a lot of the things that they really didn't like adults saying to them, like, oh, I felt that when you're your age, you'll get over it. They felt that then diminished the feelings that they actually had, or it'll be better tomorrow. At least you don't have X and X and X, problem, or, it'll be fine, or don't be whiny, or stop being such a teenager, or those sorts of things. We have to recognize that is the time of emotionality, sensation seeking we talked about earlier. And so rather than put them down for being who their biology is priming them to be, we can say, that really feels upsetting. Like if they break up with somebody, a boyfriend or something broke up with them, that's really upsetting. But it's not your problem; it's their problem. So don't. One friend of mine told me that her mother cried when her boyfriend broke up with her. Suddenly, she wasn't the one giving sympathy; she was the one giving sympathy to her mother. And she was, well, wait a minute, what just happened here? And so I think understanding their development is number one. And then if they're reluctant to talk, I find it's useful to talk in what researchers would call a psychologically distancing way. That is, talk about someone else. If your child is feeling upset at being rejected or something, go to a movie about rejection and have a discussion about how that child must feel and what could help that child. So keeping it a little distance is one way to do it if your child is reluctant to talk.
There's some interesting things that came out in your work about teenagers saying adults shouldn't speak at them; they should speak with them. Or not to them, but with them, and also not categorize them, not think of them as of a certain generation. Although what we read and what we hear in the media kind of goes against that. It's X generation or Y generation and so forth, and there are all these assumptions.
Yeah, I did research on generational differences in the studies that I used to do on the U.S. workforce, and we would find that life stage was more important than generational differences. That is, if you had kids late versus early, where you were in your career. So generalizing helps us. It helps us figure out the world. Putting things into categories does help us, but I think what 38% of young people wrote into this, what they want adults to know, is don't assume we're all the same. Don't assume that it's all negative. Some of us are lazy, but not all of us. Some of us get into trouble, but not all of us. Some of us are addicted to our iPhones, but not all of us. The internet doesn't define us and isn't going to be the death of us. Some of us, but not all of us. So I think understanding the individuality and the strengths of your children is what they want. And they want to be treated with respect in the way that you would treat a little child or a bigger child or an older person.
Holds true for parents as well, doesn't it? I mean,
yes.
The golden rule here is parents want to be treated in a way that respects them and recognizes that they are different and recognizes those differences, and children want to be treated the same way. I mean,
Exactly.
here's our friend Reed again, who wants to know, is parental style allowing some children to more easily pursue ideas of gender fluidity or conversely inhibiting it? And let me just attach something to that, if I may. I wonder how you believe or think all of this emphasis on gender fluidity is affecting this next generation, because there's a lot of it. That, and also emphasis on race to the degree that children are told if they're white, they're privileged, and if they're not white, they're not.
Um, you know, all of those things are overgeneralizations, and they don't serve any of us well. We need to recognize that, yes, people who are black, and both of my grandsons are black. Um, I, I know that I can see it, that they get treated a little differently. Um, um, because of the way that there's the color of their skin. Uh, I wish I couldn't. I wish I could say that I didn't see it, but I do.
Some
Um,
instances are treated better, though, aren't they? Especially with all this emphasis that we're navigating here in some general areas that I know may be
right.
uncomfortable, but the reality is the what's been called the woke movement has had a lot of impact, continues to have a lot of impact.
Yeah. I think things go in peaks and they need to plateau a little bit. Uh, I don't think that it's more. I don't see it in particularly my younger grandson and the way that he's treated. Mm-mm.
Yeah.
It's painful for me to see at
Yeah,
times.
I'm sorry he's going through that mistreatment, but I think it's still the argument can be made that it does go both ways, depending on
It
what
does.
school and who the children are and what
Exactly.
the community is. In fact, you've written a lot about how much teenagers, especially, are affected by the community they're in. Was there research that shows lower crime rates when people are more inclined to help, and
Yes.
it takes a village type of attitude or whatever.
It does. Social efficacy, it's called. This is wonderful research by Tony Earls, who was at Harvard, who wanted to look at differences in crime rate among, they did hundreds of neighborhoods in Chicago and found that if, if so that's what he calls social efficacy, which means that if a kid were needing help crossing the street, would you help? If someone was doing something wrong, would you, graffitiing or something like that, would you say, something, would we step in? I worked with Rob Reiner a long time ago on an initiative called I Am Your Child, and that built on that. It was the notion that we need to feel like we own all the children, that we care about the children, and for children, particularly in the teenage years, having others beside their parents who are important, other adults beside their parents who are important in their lives is significant to them. This is research that Velma McBride Murray has done and has found that how important those other people in the community are to teenagers.
Well, you've got all that research at your fingertips. It's something to marvel at. Let me go to some more questions. Stacy from Kansas City says, I homeschool my kids. How do you advise parents navigate all the digital options for education and social engagement to ensure children's safety?
I'm not sure. Can you just say a little bit more about how that would relate to homeschooling?
I think she may be talking about, how do you get your kids out of all the things that are toxic and harmful out there that are easy to access nowadays. I'm thinking of a lot of pornography, but there's so much else in addition to that.
Right. I think parents need to set limits on those, and then work with the kids on um, on solutions to that. Again, I think forbidding doesn't necessarily work. They'll get around it often. But I think that having clear rules and setting limits, and then working with the kids about implementing them or how to solve them. Um, I talk about a process in the book that I called share solutions, and it works, I think, very well for dealing with a lot of those issues, like technology, which is, I don't want you to here are our rules about what you're going to, what I think is important for you to access in the media or not. It can't be violent, whatever your own rules are. And no bullying, no this, no that. And then how, let's just brainstorm about how you're going to manage this and how it's going to work. and come up with, have a discussion so that you agree on the rules together, you agree on consequences to the rules, and then try them. And if they don't work, keep trying. But that process, I think, works very well in managing media use.
Well, I never like to read the minds of listeners, but I wonder if Stacy's also pointing out that there are schools that provide different kinds of lessons, and some of the schools are biased in different ways. I mean, they can have a religious orientation or they can have a political orientation. And so looking for materials when you're doing homeschooling can be very challenging.
I think so too. I think it feels to me like it would be overwhelming. I know that when I look for what are good programs and this, that, and the other, you find hundreds, and you really have to get into them. I think I think it's wonderful that Stacy is doing that for her children. I think that's great.
Any advice though for the homeschooling parent, to wade through all that, to be more discreet about it, or
Teaming up with other, there must be other parents either. I mean, here's an advantage of media. There are other parents both in her own community or otherwise where she can reach out and learn from them or gain advice. I know people can be snarky on media if you don't know them, but I think that I see friends putting questions like that on social media all the time. I want to know what you found is good for kids who are 10, and in their circle of friends, they get lots of answers, and I think that's really incredible.
Now, thank you again, Stacy, for your question. And let me thank Lisa for this question. She wants to know, you mentioned tech companies and government should take more responsibility. Government, our government seems uneducated. What tools or resources are available to parents?
I happen to know this because I've been consulting with them. The Biden administration is going to be releasing a report in, I think, June 20th on kids' online health and safety. There are people across the whole government who have been working on this. There are resources, there's a research agenda, there are tip sheets that the American Academy of Pediatrics has created for parents about how to talk to your kids about media. I think the people whom I've known and been part of this task force over the months have been aren't uneducated, and they come at it from many different perspectives. They come at it from understanding cyberbullying, health and safety, technology. It's been a very collaborative effort across many parts of the government.
And here's Kevin from Denver. Thank you, Kevin, for your question. He wants to know, how important are basic skills like cooking, building, creating? It seems like we've taken much of what makes life enjoyable and fulfilling out of our schools and filled it with acquiring information that they may never need after the tests.
Agree with you. I mean, I think that, art is something that is, I think, very important to me, by which I mean having ways to express yourself. Building is another way. I don't know. I think it's really important to me again, I was talking about the No Child Left Behind, which just put an overemphasis on test scores and achievement at a moment in time without
also,
giving
also an overemphasis on science and technology at the cost of the arts and
I agree.
Creative stuff.
I agree. But I'm a part of a group. This is at Johns Hopkins, where it's called the International Arts and Mind Lab. And the author, the person who's the head of that, Susan Magsamen, wrote a wonderful book called Your Brain on Art, and looks at how important art and different forms of making and doing and self-expression are to our mental health and our learning and well-being. So, all of us try in whatever way. This is my way of trying to right the ship. Need to find ways to give kids those experiences. If they don't get them in school, what can you do after school? You can also fuss at your school or work with your school.
There's also a lot of talk about working with schools to provide more for children with creative thinking, but also with critical thinking, especially the latter. And I have to ask how we can implement that more. I mean, for years we've been talking about the necessity of it, or it's an imperative.
Well, that's what the work that I'm going to be doing with AASA is about. We're looking at both the basic executive function skills that I talked about, and then the skills that build on them. And two of them are creative thinking and critical thinking. And the process that I just described, called shared solutions, builds on those skills. I just talked to a mother this morning. Her child has ADHD. He would come home from school. He would he would walk in the door and throw everything all over the floor. And then go straight for his device and then never got to his homework. And then every night would be a nightmare. And she used the process of brainstorming with her child. This is not working. You need to put your stuff away and you need to do your homework. And what ideas do you have for solving this? And no idea is a wrong idea. Let's write them all down and then let's evaluate what would work and what wouldn't work. Well, that's critical thinking. So the first was meaning making. The first skill was meaning making. The second skill was critical thinking. Was creative thinking. And then you look at what would work and what wouldn't work about that. That's perspective taking. And then there's critical thinking. So I think that as families, we can use those kinds of skills in our everyday life too.
Well, I don't feel or want to feel like we gave short shrift to Reed, who's a very important member of our podcast. He said he really wanted to hear your response to his gender fluidity question regarding parenting approaches. Love to hear your views. Thank you again, Reed.
Yeah, thank you. Got way off on something else, didn't we? Sorry about that. Adolescence is the time when kids are figuring out their identity, and they're obviously figuring out in a world. And in some ways, being more, I'm not talking about changing genders right now. I'm talking about the old ideas that just said boys should be this way and girls should be that way were constraining for some kids, that boys couldn't show emotion, that those sorts of things. So I think that there's some good things in the opening up of this. I think the young people whom I talked to who felt that they were not the gender that they were born to were very serious about it, and their parents were very serious about it. They didn't take it lightly at all. I would just hope that if any child feels that way, that they have the support of their parents to really think very carefully and hard about choices, because you don't want to make choices that would limit you in life later on. That's the way I feel about it. It's a issue that I think is important. I don't like the fact that in some cases the state is coming down on, you thou shalt not, when I feel like these are issues that parents, but with a lot of help and support, rather than you're going to have to move if you think your child wants to change gender. I don't think any child should do that easily or quickly. But the kids whom I happen to interview, and again, I happen to interview these kids because I had a nationally representative sample, so some of them show up. Not saying that they're representative of all kids, but boy, were they thoughtful about it. It was impressive. It didn't fit the stereotype that I read about, they're just swayed by whatever's going on in the world.
Well, your response is very, very thoughtful. Though I'm always reminded of something Bill Maher said when he talked about like a 7 or 8-year-old thinking as a boy, I want to be a girl, or a girl, I want to be a boy. He said, when I was 7 or 8, I wanted to be a pirate. It's good satire, but it hits home in some ways too. These kids.
I agree. That's why I think you don't want to make decisions that limit you at this stage.
Well, we didn't even talk about families, which I wanted to get in with you too. Just one question, maybe. I've always thought a lot of Tolstoy's remark, and it's so often quoted, and I wonder how it shapes up in Ellen Galinsky's mind. All happy families are the same, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. Paraphrasing here. It's been mistranslated from the Russian, but is that pretty much square with your research?
It's a great question, of course. I think I would give more diversity to happy families too. I think there are commonalities among happy families and unhappy families, and there are lots of differences. But if happy families, I think, have a real respect for, a real caring for, a real problem-solving attitude, who are every day is a new day and will keep trying to figure this out kind of a view. And and unhappy families would be more into not seeing problems as a challenge, but as a threat, and would be blaming and criticizing and condemning and making other people feel bad. So I think there are commonalities there.
Well, let me extend thanks, first of all, to all of you who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and all who will be joining us on Apple, Spotify, and our website at graymatter.show. And if you aren't yet a member of this podcast, again, I invite you to join by going to our website at graymatter.show, where you can find any previous episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to email any reactions, thoughts, or recommendations to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And my thanks to the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Colin, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya, and a special thanks to this week's special guest, Ellen Galinsky.
Thank you.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.